Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, February 7th, 2024. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. blocks the Yemen-Saudi peace deal. So the U.S. is purposely blocking a Yemen peace deal that was negotiated between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, and this was reported by the New York Times on Tuesday. So the U.S. recent decision to redesignate the Houthis as specially designated global terrorists will block the payment of public sector workers living in Houthi-controlled Yemen who have gone without pay for years. The payment of civil workers has been a key demand of the Houthis throughout the negotiations with the Saudis and the Saudi-backed forces in Yemen. And this is the first phase of this Yemen peace deal. It's not exactly clear what the deal is when it comes to how these government workers are going to get paid. For years, the Houthis were demanding that they get paid using oil and gas revenue from oil and gas that's being sold from areas of Yemen that are not controlled by the Houthis. That revenue goes to the Saudi-backed government, which is based in Saudi Arabia. So they want that money to pay for the workers. The details of this peace deal aren't exactly clear. I know at one point the Saudis offered to just pay it themselves or pay like the first year or something. So not exactly sure what the mechanism is, but anyway, this phase of the peace deal would also fully open Yemen's airports and seaports that have been under blockade since 2015. And this is another aspect of the deal that would be complicated by new U.S. sanctions, which will go into effect later this month. A U.S. official told the New York Times that the U.S. would only allow the payment of Yemeni civil salaries if the Houthis choose the path of peace and stop attacking shipping in the Red Sea. And the Houthis have been clear that these operations will only stop once the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza ends. And instead of pressing Israel to stop what it's doing in Gaza, Biden chose escalation, and he launched this new war against the Houthis, which has just escalated the situation pretty dramatically, actually. Now, every day there's Houthis firing missiles and drones, the U.S. Navy, intercepting some hit commercial ships, some don't. These things continue almost on a daily basis at this point. And then other context that's important, the Houthis, they're officially known as Ansar Allah. They control the Yemen capital of Sana'a. They've controlled it since 2014. And the territory that they control is where about 70 to 80% of Yemen's population lives. So they're often called, the Houthi rebels in Western media, but they are the governing force in that part of Yemen, and they have been for a long time. So back to the current situation. Since January 12th, the U.S. has launched at least 18 rounds of missile strikes on Yemen, and President Biden has acknowledged these strikes are not working since the Houthis continue their attacks, but he vowed they will continue anyway. And of course, the history of the conflict, the Saudi war against the Houthis, the Saudi UAE war against the Houthis, that was so brutal, that killed at least 377,000 people between 2015 and 2022. And that's considered a minimum by, people who are more familiar with the conflict than me. They believe the number of dead is actually significantly higher. Many people starved to death and died of disease due to the blockade and the brutal bombing campaign that targeted civilian infrastructure, their waterworks, sewage treatment plants. They bombed food supplies, all sorts of horrific stuff. So Yemen has been experiencing a relative calm since April 2022 when the Saudis and the Houthis reached a ceasefire. But now Yemen's getting bombed again, and the U.S. is trying to disrupt a peace deal, a lasting peace deal. The good news is that the Saudis and the Houthis still seem very determined not to restart their war against each other. When Biden launched his bombing campaign in Yemen, Saudi Arabia urged the U.S. to avoid escalation, which as someone who followed this war very closely for the last few years, the fact that the Saudis are urging restraint from the U.S. is just really something. And this week, a Houthi official said that they are ready to formally make peace with the Saudis. Hussein al-Ezi, who's the deputy foreign minister of Ansar Allah, said, quote, Sana'a is prepared for peace with Riyadh despite the challenges posed by the U.S. and its associated Yemeni groups, end quote. So some members of the U.S. and Saudi-backed Yemeni Presidential Council, which I think was formed in 2022, they formed this council as it became clear they were not going to reinstall Hadi, who was the president that the Houthis ousted from Sana'a. So some members of this council are calling for a ground campaign against the Houthis, but they don't really have much influence. They are considered the government of hotels, since they are living out of hotels in Saudi Arabia, most of them. Although this new presidential council does include the Southern Transition Council, the STC, which controls a lot of the area of what used to be South Yemen, and they want to separate from the north. And their leader recently also called for a ground campaign against the Houthis. But as far as I know, people I know who know more about Yemen than me say that for the most part, the country is united right now against Israel, against the U.S. Even a lot of the Houthis' enemies are coming around to their side. They're uniting the country. So the chances of a ground campaign at this point are slim. But it just goes to show the lengths, the extent to which Biden is willing to go to support the Israeli mass killing of Palestinians in Gaza. All right, the next one here is some good news. The House fails to pass a military aid bill for Israel. So the House on Tuesday sank an effort by Speaker Mike Johnson to pass a $17.6 billion military aid bill for Israel to support the slaughter in Gaza. The bill was fast-tracked under the suspension of House rules. So for procedural reasons, they suspended the rules to have a quick vote on this bill, and that required it to have a 2/3 majority to be advanced to the Senate. So not a simple majority. So the bill actually failed in a vote of 250 to 180. So you had more members of the House vote for it than against it, but because they suspended the rules, it didn't pass. And, it goes to show that Johnson and the pro-Israel supporters were probably just thinking, oh, it's Israel, we'll be able to, get it through no problem. So the fact that they didn't pass it, I think, is bad PR for, the Israel lobby, AIPAC and everything. They're probably not happy about this, even though Israel's probably still going to get its money. It just might take a little longer, but it's not going to stop the U.S. from sending them more bombs anyway. But anyway, so it failed in a vote of 250 to 180. 166 Democrats and 14 Republicans voted against it. The bill was under a threat of a veto from the White House since President Biden wants Congress to pass the $118 billion foreign military aid and border bill that includes about $14 billion for Israel and $60 billion for Ukraine. So the White House said, we're going to veto the standalone Israel bill. It might not have even been taken up for a vote in the Senate. So most Democrats that oppose this because the White House opposed it. And although there were some that came out against the unlimited support for Israel, I saw Ro Khanna say, it's a blank check for Netanyahu, let's not send it. And I saw Rashida Tlaib, of course, was very against it. And probably some more progressives that actually voted because they don't want to give Israel this money while they're killing all these Palestinians. But I think for the most part, it's Democrats just aligning with the White House. So the House, if you remember, they previously passed a $14.3 billion bill for Israel that paid for the aid by cutting funding from the Internal Revenue Service. But that was opposed by Democrats and never taken up in the Senate. So some members of the House Freedom Caucus voted against the $17.6 billion for fiscal reasons and because they want to prioritize action on the border. So kind of representing that view was Chip Roy. He's Republican from Texas. He said, quote, well, it's unpaid for... Sorry, I jumbled that a bit. He said, quote, well, it's unpaid for and our borders are wide open. Can't go to my constituents and say, here's $17 billion, even for someone who I love, like Israel, and a good friend, somebody I fully support. I can't do that, end quote. I wonder if he really loves Israel. A man who's taken a much more principled stand against this is Thomas Massey from Kentucky. And he said before the vote that he would oppose the bill because the U.S. could not afford it and because of where the money will actually go. He said, quote, most of this money will go directly to the U.S. military-industrial complex, which, if you're keeping up, prefers to be referred to as the defense industrial base now. Watch for these stocks to go up on Monday, end quote. I shouldn't downplay what Chip Roy said. The fact that 14 Republicans voted against aid for Israel is actually pretty significant. I can't think of a time when more than Massey or like one other Republican voted against military aid to Israel. All right, so the next one here, Mitch McConnell says that the $118 billion bill will not become law. So more good news, I think. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, he said on Tuesday that the $118 billion military aid and border bill that was unveiled over the weekend will likely not become law due to GOP opposition. He said, quote, we had a very robust discussion about whether or not this product could ever become law, and it's been made pretty clear to us by the speaker that it will not become law, end quote. So a day earlier, the Associated Press reported that McConnell recommended to GOP senators that they vote against the first procedural vote on the bill that's expected to happen on Wednesday. Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, has said that this bill is dead on arrival, and he's looking to push forward the standalone resolution, and that has failed. So the Republican opposition to the $118 billion is over the border policies. Senate negotiators spent months working on a border deal for the legislation, but Johnson said the House was left out, and Democrats are blaming Trump for this Republican opposition because Trump says he's against it, says Republicans should kill this bill. So Chuck Schumer said on Tuesday, quote, Leader McConnell and the Republican conference did a 180-degree reversal. They're quaking at the knees in fear of Donald Trump, end quote. So this spending includes $60 billion for the proxy war in Ukraine, about $14 billion for Israel, $4.8 billion for Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region, and $2.44 billion for U.S. Central Command and this new war against the Houthis. So I think, infighting and delays and them not agreeing on things is kind of the best that we could hope for right now, is that this just gets pushed back as much as possible. Because, Johnson, has said he thinks he wants to pass the Ukraine money. He just wants the border deal first. But, of course, for him, Israel is the priority. All right, so the next one here, 1/5 of Israeli hostages in Gaza are dead. So Israeli intelligence officials have concluded that more than 1/5 of the remaining Israeli hostages in Gaza are dead. News that is sure to increase the domestic anger directed at the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So the Israeli assessment, which was obtained by the New York Times, said at least 30 out of 136 Israelis who are still held captive in Gaza have died since the start of the Israeli onslaught. The report did not say how they were killed, but it's likely that they were killed by Israeli forces. There's a lot of the Israeli hostages who were freed from Gaza in the prisoner and hostage exchange that happened said that their primary fear while they were there was getting killed by Israel's relentless bombing campaign. And we know Israel has definitely killed at least some of the hostages, because in December, Israeli troops shot and killed 3 Israeli hostages who were shirtless and waving a white flag, gunned them down. And there's also a mother of an Israeli who died in Gaza. She has alleged that her son was killed by poison gas that Israel pumped into the tunnels underneath the strip, and she cited a toxicology report. Israeli media has reported that Israel's military is aware that bombing the tunnels could create toxic gases such as carbon monoxide, which does risk killing captive Israelis. So this made me think back to a report from the New York Times last month that quoted 4 senior Israeli military commanders who said they concluded the only way to secure the release of the hostages and not get them killed is through diplomacy. There's no military option to get them freed alive. So that was interesting. And now we're seeing, the results of this continued military operation and just brutal bombing campaign and ground campaign that's happening. And Israel and Hamas are currently negotiating a potential hostage deal through Egyptian and Qatari mediators. It's unclear right now. Hamas apparently gave a response. They're still calling for the permanent ceasefire and a permanent withdrawal of Israeli troops, which Netanyahu has, continues to reject. His political survival is, the only thing keeping him in office is what he's doing in Gaza. So he wants it to continue. All right. So the next one here, Israel has failed to provide evidence for the UNRWA Hamas ties claim. So this is one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. And it says news outlets with access to the summary of an intelligence dossier that claims employees of the UN Aid Agency for Palestinians participated in the Hamas attack say that it does not include evidence to back up the claims. So if you remember, I covered something Kyle wrote yesterday that said Israel is not giving up this intelligence dossier that it has that supposedly shows these UNRWA employees were involved in the October 7th Hamas attack. Well, Channel 4, the British television channel, and the Daily Beast both reviewed a 6-page summary of the dossier, and they found that there's nothing there. There's no actual evidence to prove the Israeli claim. And again, this is something that the U.S. jumped on. Israel made the allegations, and they cut off UNRWA. The same day that the ICJ ruled that it's plausible Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. Ignore all the allegations about the IDF, about the military that they're funding, to the hilt with all these bombs and stuff. Ignore all those allegations, but the second there's allegations about UNRWA, cut them off, even as Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are starving to death. All right, so the next one here, shocking spike in illegal force against Palestinians in the West Bank. This is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute, and it says a new report from Amnesty International documents that over the past 4 months, Israeli forces unleashed a brutal wave of violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, and that includes Israeli forces and Israeli settlers who are looking to, take over Palestinian homes and land. It says that Israeli forces murdered children, brutally cracked down on protesters, and blocked ambulances from reaching injured Palestinians to provide medical care. The death toll for children in the West Bank since the outbreak of the war in Gaza hit 100. So really, it's just a summary of what has been clear since October, the spike in violence against Palestinians. And again, the settlers really taking advantage of the tensions, of the kind of distraction. More eyes are on Gaza. If this was happening separate, say what's happening in Gaza wasn't happening, this would be all over the news. There'd be so much attention on the situation in the West Bank. All right. And the violence in the West Bank increased in the beginning of 2023 when the Netanyahu government came. They came in at like the very end of 2022, and they started raids in the West Bank, and settler violence, and things started to increase because you had this government come in and explicitly say they're going to prioritize expanding settlements, and they want to ultimately annex the West Bank. That's what they said in their coalition statement when they formed the government. So, of course, that emboldened the settlers, and that's exactly what they wanted. There's actual settlers in the Netanyahu government. All right, so the next one here, Lebanon rejects a call to push Hezbollah from the border. This article is from The Cradle. Lebanese caretaker foreign minister Abdallah Abu Habib voiced on the 6th of February that the nation rejects recent Israeli and international demands seeking to push the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah north of the Litani River, saying that Beirut will not accept partial solutions to resolving the cross-border conflict. So this is what Israel is saying. They want Hezbollah to pull back north of this river, and if they don't, they're basically threatening invasion. Bao Habib said, quote, Western countries demand the retreat of Hezbollah for about 8 to 10 kilometers north of the Litani. This is a formula that Lebanon rejects. Beirut will not accept partial solutions that do not bring the desired peace and do not secure stability, but will lead to a renewal of the war again and again, end quote. So the situation right now, I know the U.S. is trying to broker a deal between Israel and Lebanon, and there's some back and forth going on. But he's saying, Lebanon is saying that they want a comprehensive implementation of UN Resolution 1701, which was issued following the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war, which called for a respect for the Blue Line, which was a border drawn up by the UN in 2000. Basically, it does say that Hezbollah should withdraw and move back, north of that river. But it also says, has rules for Israel around that line. And one thing Lebanon wants is the liberation, they call it, of Sheba Farms, which is a disputed territory in the Golan Heights, which Israel annexed from Syria in 1981. And under Trump, nobody ever recognized that as Israeli territory until the Trump administration recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli. And inside the Golan Heights, there's Sheba Farms in the northern part of it, and it's claimed by, it's kind of strange, it's occupied by Israel, and it's claimed by both Lebanon and Syria. They have their own dispute over this territory, but this is something Lebanon wants Israel out of there. So this is all part of, if they're trying to negotiate a deal, this is something that Lebanon wants, but of course Israel's not going to give that up. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. to increase military aid to Guyana. Wherever you look around the world, you will find a country that receives military aid from the U.S. So the U.S. will increase military aid to Guyana amid tensions with neighboring Venezuela over the disputed Guyana Essequibo region. And the AP reported this, but they did not detail how much the U.S. will provide, but said the U.S. will help Guyana acquire new helicopters, a fleet of military drones, and radar technology for the first time. In 2023, I just looked back at the U.S. Foreign Assistance website, which shows how much countries get in aid each year. So Guyana received $2.7 million in total aid. That includes everything, and the only military type that I saw was $400,000 from the Pentagon's International Military Education and Training Program, which means the U.S. has been training Guyana's military. Guyana is a very small country with a population of only around 800,000. According to AP, the Caribbean nation's military numbers less than 5,000 troops, so it's a very small military. So news of the new military aid came after U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner met with officials in Guyana. The U.S. has been stepping up military cooperation with Guyana after Venezuelans voted in a referendum late last year to make the Essequibo region a Venezuelan state. So if you see on the map here, this area highlighted in orange is the disputed territory. And Venezuela and Guyana agreed in December not to use military force to resolve the dispute, but tensions remain high. Venezuela deployed 6,000 troops to its border with Guyana, its border on this region. And this is a very resource-rich territory. It's been under Guyana's control for over a century, but Venezuela has always disputed this tribunal ruling from back in 1899, which was an American-British tribunal. I believe it was 2 Americans, 2 Britons, and 1 Russian. They tried to make it seem kind of partial. The Americans were supposed to be neutral as well, but they ruled in favor of the British Empire and said that this territory belonged to the British Empire, which controlled Guyana at the time. So again, it was always disputed. In 1966, the two sides signed a deal called the Geneva Agreement, which basically said they would pursue a mutually satisfactory solution. Tensions have risen over Essequibo in recent years as there's been more oil discoveries. The American energy giant ExxonMobil discovered massive oil reserves off the coast of Guyana and in waters that are claimed by Venezuela. So it's this huge offshore drilling project off the coast there. And in recent years, I know the U.S. sent a few warships in that area to do their so-called freedom of navigation operations to challenge Venezuela's claims. So, it's just one of those things, like, why is the U.S. getting involved in this dispute? But, maybe I just answered the question talking about Exxon's big project there. But, and when it comes to Venezuela, the diplomacy has recently broken down between the U.S. and Venezuela. The U.S. is reimposing sanctions. It eased some sanctions, but Venezuela is essentially under a U.S. economic embargo and has been since 2019 when the Trump administration backed a very failed coup attempt against Maduro. All right, so the last story here, Kurt Campbell confirmed as the number 2 diplomat. So on Tuesday, the Senate confirmed China hawk Kurt Campbell as the Deputy Secretary of State, the second highest ranking position in the State Department. So Campbell is taking the position after serving as President Biden's top Asia official on the National Security Council. He also worked in the Obama administration's State Department from 2009 to 2013, and he oversaw a policy known as the Asia Pivot, which began the U.S. military buildup in the region that we're seeing really accelerate today, really accelerated under Trump, accelerating even more under Biden. This is all explicitly to prepare for a future war with China. So just to show what a China hawk this guy is, back in 2021, Campbell said that when it came to China, the period of engagement has come to an end and that the relationship will now be defined by competition. And since then, tensions have really increased between the U.S. and China. The rhetoric has kind of toned down recently. I don't know if you remember in 2021, the first year of the Biden administration, they were saying crazy things about China, and 2022 as well. Biden was saying that they're in a competition to win the 21st century. And of course, Biden declared that he would defend Taiwan. He said that 4 times. The first 3 times, the White House kind of walked it back, but not the 4th time. And the 4th time, this guy Campbell came out. He was asked about it, and he said, we'll let Biden's comments speak for themselves, was how he put it. So I have a feeling he's the one that kind of engineered that because, National Security Council being the top Asia guy, it's a pretty influential position. And he is replacing Wendy Sherman, who she retired in July 2023. So maybe there's a little silver lining here. Victoria Nuland, the notorious, Russia hawk who's credited with orchestrating the coup in Ukraine in 2014, she has been filling in as the acting Deputy Secretary of State. So she's going to go back to her role. I forget the exact title, but she's basically number 3. So, not good, but at least she's not number 2. But I don't know. I mean, Campbell, when it comes to China, he's not anything better. And he's also a Russia hawk, of course. And during his Senate confirmation hearing, he said, oh, yeah, we got to keep giving aid to Ukraine. And I pulled up a quote that he made, a quote from him from a couple years ago in 2022. He said that he believed the U.S. could sustain 2 theaters of war as it did during World War II. And he's talking about war with Russia and war with China. So that's who this guy is. He said, quote, "It's difficult, it's expensive, but it is also essential. And I believe that we're entering a period where that is what will be demanded of the United States and this generation of Americans," end quote. So portraying this new Cold War with China and Russia as a generational challenge. All these guys want is their own World War II, that they always heard their parents or grandparents talking about, and they want their big war in the Pacific, but it's gonna kill us all, so we gotta stop them. Anyway, that's it for the news for today, so go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Mark S. Episcopus, "No magic U.S. weapon left for offensive Ukraine victory." One from Gideon Levy, "The Gaza I loved will never be the same." One from Ryan McMacken, "Humanitarianism as an excuse for colonialism and imperialism." One from John Hoffman, "Is the U.S. on the verge of another forever war?" Definitely go check that out at the National Interest. One from Ted Snyder, "Spotlight at the American Conservative. Military escalation against Iran is foolish and unjustified." Go check out the blog. Go scroll around the page. Just because you listen to this show doesn't mean that there's not other content for you to see at antiwar.com. That's it for me for today. Again, support us by sharing the show, telling your friends about antiwar.com. All that stuff really helps out. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.